Let's talk about how you can write an effective essay introduction. And the first thing to note here is that you might not actually write your introduction at the very beginning. It may take you a while as you develop your essay to figure out what you're saying, what your thesis is going to be. And because of that, I tend to suggest to people that they actually start elsewhere in their paper, that they start with what they know. So start with a specific point or argument, and then kind of get broader and broader until you really know what the thesis is, what the argument is that connects all of your subpoints. So that's the first kind of thing to observe here. And then if we think about this thesis, the thesis is going to be typically the final bit of your intro. In this case, we have 3 sentences together that form the thesis, and that's quite all right. You don't have to squeeze everything into one sentence. So think about this thesis then, and then try to make sure that everything before it builds up to that. And that's why once you have your thesis, you can kind of say to yourself, okay, what kind of information does my reader have to know to make sense of my thesis? And that's what this rest, or what the rest of your introduction is going to be. This is going to be the context, okay, the context and the extra information that's going to allow the reader to make sense of the thesis. And structurally, that's kind of the big point that we want to take away from here. Okay, the next thing we'll do here is we'll read through our introduction, our sample introduction, and point out a few other things to observe. So this one reads, E.B. White's Stuart Little, and notice here that right away, if we're writing about literature, we give some clues as to the topic. So don't introduce, your author or your novel or your historical topic or economic topic or whatever you're writing about. Don't introduce it halfway through your paragraph. We really need to start with it as soon as possible. So Stuart Little is a book full of digressions and failures, or failure. One thing to note here is that what we started with is something a little bit unusual. You might not expect to read a book that's about failure. Certainly not a kid's novel in this case. And the unusual creates a certain amount of surprise, right? This is kind of surprising to the reader. And surprise is good. So we want to start with something that will kind of startle, that will make the reader interested. But what we don't want to do is we don't want some kind of corny hook. And a lot of teachers, when they talk about the introduction, is they say, well, just start with a hook, right? Start with the definition or an interesting fact or a quotation. But I find that really artificial. And I would suggest that you don't start with your hook and then kind of build from there. As I mentioned before, start with your thesis and build up to the argument. So what we've done here then is we have created a bit of a surprise, but as we'll see in a moment, this leads directly to our thesis, and there's a kind of organic development rather than something artificial. The paragraph continues as follows. It goes, despite Stuart's adventurous spirit, he never seems to get anywhere. He quickly crashes his car, his date with Harriet Ames goes horribly wrong, and at the end of the book he is no nearer to finding Margalo. All of this is sort of proof of our initial statement, right? We said, well, it is a book about failure, and here are some examples. We want to make sure, though, that we don't have too much proof, too many specific examples in our intro. We can save a lot of them for later, for the body paragraphs. But it's good, at least at this point, to give a little bit of flavor as to what's coming up. The other thing we're doing here is we're starting to describe what you might think of as a problem. And that's a very good strategy for writing introductions. Think of your intro as a problem, and then the thesis is the solution. Okay? So we want to set up this problem. We want to create tension. Tension is good in an introduction. And this one continues, many children wrote to E.B. White asking if Stuart ever found his beloved bird. I like this here because it's kind of saying, well, you know what? Lots of other people have this question, right? People want to know, why does the book end in failure? Why does it have so many digressions? And what we're starting to see here is what's called a research question. So every introduction should be answering, a research question. Every introduction should answer a research question, and it can be really helpful for yourself if you actually spell out what that question is. In this case, the question is, why is this book so digressive, and why does it have so much failure in it? And there might be a follow-up question which goes, is this a kid's book? Right? Should children be reading this, or is this more for adults? Okay, so we want to spell out the research question. That's the problem, and then we need to have a solution. Notice that this introduction here uses this word however, and that's often a common word that you'll see in introductions. It's this sort of shift that happens. So we've set up the problem, and then we say, well, now we can go in a different direction. We can sort of create the solution at this point. Another way to think about this is in terms of appearance. So something seems to be a certain way, okay, but the reality might be something else. And if you think of this kind of dichotomy or this split between appearance and reality, that can be a really effective way to start your introduction. This is how it might appear to many of us, but if we look more closely, this is what we see, and that's our thesis. Okay, so let's read on. This one goes, however, the point of the book is to see beauty in failure, to celebrate the journey itself, and to avoid all cliches in answering Stuart's famous question, how many of you know what's important? Notice that we have a quotation from the book. We can use other quotations as well from critics, but often it's good just to have one quotation in your introduction. Not too many, of course, because then it gets really cluttered, but it might be good just to have one or two quotations to give a bit of a sense of either the criticism out there, the viewpoints of others, or the book itself. And what this is pointing out is that our research question, right, what is important, what should you care about, is failure, does failure have meaning? This sort of question is already in the book itself to some extent too. The other thing to note about the sentence is this reference to cliches, because this is rather clever as the sentence starts out with a bunch of cliches. Okay, we talk about the journey, celebrating the journey. And that, of course, is a cliche. But then the sentence nicely shifts to say, well, the book is also trying to avoid cliches. And that creates a nice tension in itself. Finally, we get to our thesis statement here. And I'll let you read it yourself. But as you can see, it's a fairly complex thesis statement because we're trying to balance a number of things in answering this question. And we're introducing some new terms as well. So we have terms like modern aesthetic. Aesthetic has to do with the appreciation of beauty. We're introducing terms like romantic and realistic and sublime. And all of these we can really develop and talk about more in future paragraphs. We don't have to define them all at this point. But we have quite a bit of complexity here to go on, and that will make the reader interested and eager to read on. So to sum up then, what you want in your introduction is you want a problem, you want some kind of tension, you don't want corny hooks, but what you want instead is a thesis that answers that problem, that resolves that question, and then you want to build up to that thesis with enough context so that the reader can make sense of your question and is interested enough to read on.